You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're chatting with Brian O'Looney about his new book, Increments of Neighborhood. We chat about the housing types in the book, whether big data has a role in housing, and why the basic economics of buildings matter. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Overhead Wire Media's production of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning in Practice. If you want to purchase our recent audiobook production of this 1909 classic, go to raymondunwin.com and click on the link to Awsound. There you can download it as a podcast series where each chapter is a new episode. You can also get it wherever audiobooks are sold. Today's podcast is also brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much to those that listen and support each month. We really appreciate it. And now, if you'd like to get a hold of our bus-only soccer-style scarf with dedicated lane designs, donate $10 or more a month on Patreon and we'll send one along. We also really appreciate the $1 or $2 a month support. So if you'd like to sign up and keep us going, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also purchase the scarf by going to theoverheadwire.com. And I would be remiss if we didn't mention the Overhead Wire newsletter. We've been doing it for 14 years, and I hope to be doing it for 14 more. We're now at 67,000 links tagged by topic and city for subscribers. Sign up today for a 2-week trial by going to theoverheadwire.com. And finally, we've been keeping a list of urban issue webinars. So if you want to find one that you're interested in, go to bit.ly/urbanwebinar to see the list. And make sure you capitalize the U and the W. We found out recently that if they aren't capitalized, you go to a Ukrainian urban planning sign-up list. Always something fun in our crazy world. Before we get to this week's show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both this show, Talking Headways, and Mondays at the Overhead Wire, where this music I'm talking about comes from, on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. Subscribe today. Well, Brian O'Looney, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's great to be here. Good to talk to you today about a lot of shared interests that sounds like you and I have.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a design architect with Torty Gallison Partners. I work on a lot of mixed use, mixed income, but mostly residential above with retail, often supermarkets on the ground floor in both suburban and urban locations across the U.S.
And what got you interested in architecture and planning?
I wanted to be a car designer, and it's too hard to become one. It's very competitive, and even if you're really good, doesn't necessarily mean you succeed in it. And when I was in college, I was exposed to some very good academics, one of whom was very passionate about architecture, a guy by the name of Vincent Scully, who you may have heard of. And from there, I went on. I always thought I might go into development, but ended up staying in architecture, being as successful as I guess I could be to stay with it. And I really do love what we do. And I love being surrounded by people who love to do what we do.
What did you think about car designs these days?
There's a lot of transformation happening, and it's both exciting and maddening. I think certain aspects of the industry have kind of become stale, and the world is becoming, the old adage of the longer, lower, wider has gone away, and we're mostly moving to SUVs with most companies. Ford will have one traditional automobile, the Mustang, going forth in a year or so, and there's maybe 5 or 6 companies. Lincoln has nothing but SUVs right now. That's disappointing. Another aspect of the industry that's disappointing is the fact that they've moved away from color. You used to be able to get greens, blues, reds, yellows, even purples occasionally. And right now the choice you have is silver, platinum, champagne, bronze, black, charcoal, and white. So those are the disappointing parts of the industry. The fun parts of the industry, I think there's a lot of really interesting design going on, both technologically with EV design, moving away from the internal combustion engine, as well as I think we've gotten past all the time where we were worried about regulation, and there's a lot of interesting design with capital D happening in the auto world today. So it's exciting to watch the industry, although there's been a lot of consolidation. There are going to be fewer makes. There are going to be fewer designs out there, but there's still opportunities right now where people are doing very innovative things. And again, in our world, when you are in more rural or outer suburban areas, an automobile is an amazing thing to have. It offers freedom, it offers ability to see people. In urban places, it's actually a hindrance to being free and moving around. And so we understand that in what we do in our world. And frankly, a lot of what the auto provided when I was growing up, the freedom, the ability to see friends, the ability to have a girlfriend, has been supplanted by the phone. And so, General Motors was the largest company in the world in 1965, right? And today, the largest company in the world is Apple. And in many ways, they were really doing the same thing at the time, providing the connection, providing the ability to interact with people and communicate. That's what General Motors was selling in 65, and that's what Apple is selling today.
That's really fascinating. Do you think that cars have a future in terms of, how they're used today? I mean, you mentioned that in cities, and we talk about this a lot on the show, but you mentioned in cities they're harder to justify, but in rural and more suburban areas where there's not a lot of options and the built form is such that it just doesn't help transit or other modes, walking, biking much at all. Do you think there's a future? It's interesting because of what we see from these EV companies and the companies that are focusing on trying to build EVs, but we know that there's still, some associated negative aspects of that, including pollution from tire waste. And there's a problem with getting all the rare earth metals we need for batteries and things like that. But I'm just curious about that, if that's something that you thought about.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the shared model takes hold and takes root. I mean, it's already taken hold in urban communities with Uber and Lyft, Car2Go, and other formats trying to come with a part-time ownership or part-time usage of vehicles. And it'll be interesting to see how that proceeds into the future, particularly with more consolidation, when people realize they don't want to have an auto loan, they don't want to have insurance payments in hyper-urban locations. And they don't have to. And it's really easy to rent a car or to get an Uber or a Lyft for point-to-point movements. I think also those systems will start to support transit systems. I think the idea of autonomous vehicles have flaws in that roadway throughput will be a big issue in urban places. I actually did a presentation on this a couple of years back where I didn't think there was a solution to throughput on roadways. Because right now, if you had a motorhome that you could drive on 56th Street, 6th Avenue, 57th Street, 5th Avenue, 24/7, and then it gets gas and comes back and does it on its own, that's cheaper than owning an apartment in New York City right now in that location. So if everyone tried to do that, you would have absolutely no mobility in the city. So there's going to be a need for ways of regulating that, regulating throughput. And it may need to be street segment by street segment to make it work and make it function. Each roadway will have a price. And I didn't think there was a way of solving that, but the folks in Singapore a couple of years back have already started having GPS tolling. So you buy a car in Singapore today, it captures tolls by GPS in the car. So you drive this roadway, it has a price. And that price can be both place-based as well as time-based. So driving 56th Street between 6th and 5th Avenue in New York in the middle of the night would be a different price than driving it during the day, and somehow figuring that out. And that's happening now, and Singapore is leading the way on that. And so I see that, I just see that as the eventuality for managing throughput on roadways, particularly in urban places. And that would eventually lead to a system, and I don't know whether it'll be publicly owned transit or privately shared transit systems that then manage the cost structure. But it'll get to the point once that's in place that it truly will be too expensive to use the roadways with private vehicles. And the question is, how do we manage that as shared resources? But right now, we've subsidized most roadway usage, including the urban ones. We're still subsidizing parking. I mean, Donald Shook talks about managing the parking resources in a time-based way, trying to keep 1 out of every 9 spaces on every block open for maximum commercial activity. And that's happening. I mean, San Francisco is obviously pioneering there, and I'm sure other places as well. So those kinds of market-based reform will lead to greater shared usage and transit need as we figure out how to refine our transportation and mobility systems. And that's coming down the road because it's just the public is paying way too much right now, even though they're not real for free mobility in the automobile.
So I dragged you off into a transportation conversation, but your book is Increments of Neighborhood, and I have it right here. And it's a great piece. There's a little bit of transportation in the back, but most of it's about design and buildings. I'm curious what got you to write this.
I've been thinking about it for 20 something years. I mean, I was at a firm with an architect named David Schwartz, and we were working on some really interesting projects at the time, building instant downtowns. And we did a project in a place called South Lake, Texas at the time. And the day it opened, they threw a parade because there was this great place that people could come to and enjoy. And I wanted to do more of that. With them, I did a university building. We did a ballpark. Those are great projects, architect dream jobs. But I loved working on these downtowns and these instant places that grew. In working in those jobs, I realized there's a lot more kinds of products that can contribute to those great walkable destinations. And a lot of them had to do with residential. And I then moved to Tortigalis, where I'm now a partner, to learn that work, to learn everything about stick construction, about everything. We're one of the few firms that works from single family houses all the way to high rises and everything in between. And that everything in between really hasn't been documented. People don't quite understand the differences between why in the marketplace certain things are getting built over others. And that's why I wrote the book, was to help people understand what's happening, what's getting built around them when they're trying to do infill and trying to do good walkable cores. The quarter retail development and suburban tract housing was not something that was covered in this book. Only covered as examples of what does not make a good walkable neighborhood. So they're the options of missed opportunities.
Yeah, I like that part of the book. In the book, that you have the type and you have images of it and you have its cost. It's a typology, right? It's a typology layout. And you have that part that's missed opportunities, and it shows kind of like what you shouldn't do, which I really like.
Yeah, and so originally the book was only going to be the market types, and then was working with a publisher I actually didn't stay with, who asked that we add the piece on the public building types because they become anchors for community. And we did that. And then finally, we realized that we had these parking types, but it was part of a spectrum in mobility. And that's how we got to adding that whole mobility section at the back. So you could understand, so we could start to talk and consider different vehicular parking arrangements and the mobility that's privatized versus that which is on the public side. So buses, BRT, train, and other kinds of mobility resources that we use, but aren't looked side by side with the parts of our mobility structures that are privatized, parking garages and parking lots and such. A lot of what I'm passionate about, what we do, I mean, I'm really focused on transit-oriented development. And so a lot of the types in here are really for those seeking I wouldn't say car-free lifestyle, but a car-reduced lifestyle, and having a life where you might have to drive to work and come back home, but once you're home, there's amenities nearby. Living in Kentlands, I am in the burbs, but we can walk to a movie theater. I've got about 10 restaurants we can walk to. If we want to haul bags, I can actually go to Whole Foods and haul bags home. And I find value and freedom in this way of living. When I was a kindergartner, we lived in a house where I walked home from school every day. And then we moved to a house that was suburban remote, didn't have sidewalks, and I just hated it. And we would go to Brooklyn, where my grandmother lived, in the summer, and I thought that place was amazing because I could walk to the boardwalk in Coney Island. I'm like, why doesn't everyone want to live like this?
Yeah. You began the book by talking a little bit about real estate products, and I'm wondering why that was an important frame for writing this.
The interaction of code, law, and the market drive what is getting built more than what architects think or what developers feel the market needs. What we can build cost effectively ends up often being what gets built, and often being what is a legacy for the future that then gets transformed over time. And sometimes some of the things we're building now are harder to transform in the future. And so talking about that in a way that helps folks understand the choices when one is planning a new area, what decisions might lead to in terms of the ability to be flexible in the future, is a big issue that we're running into a lot of our work. A lot of projects that we do at transit stations, for example, day one, there's not enough density and not enough people there to support retail, but they want that. They know they want that to be there in the future. And so how you design a building to allow for that is important. And so you need to know how the building construction works and what you can do to allow your building to day one be residential, but in the future meet that vision of providing restaurants and coffee shops and such at the end state.
There's definitely a disconnect, though, between what people want and what people think they want versus what they can actually get for the money that they're spending, right? Like, I think that it's interesting to see in this book and in other places as well, where we have these grand plans and people draw these buildings that are, 4 stories and retail on the bottom. Every street has retail, and we know that just doesn't necessarily work. It's pretty, but it doesn't necessarily work. So, what's the disconnect then between what people want and what they actually end up getting?
So there's a couple big disconnects. The first big disconnect is between zoning law or master plans, and the building codes are changing. So some of the rules, even over the last 5 years, have morphed. But it used to be that you'd see these master plans for 7 or 8 story buildings. And at the time, those would be unbuildable because the limit for wood buildings was up to 6 stories. That's changed now. Now you can build 8 story wood buildings where you have a 5 story wood building and 3 stories of concrete underneath. And that's even changing because there's a new movement to have super tall wood buildings out of post and beam construction. And there are some pilots across the North America happening right now in that world.
CLT, cross laminated timber.
Right, right. But the tranches are still the same. You can build high rises, any height possible with concrete or steel construction that are fire protected. There's then the next big tranche down is type 3 construction, which comes from the historic Chicago type, where you have masonry walls and wood floor construction. And so that is a type. And that world has been modified. The masonry walls were considered 2-hour or 3-hour walls. And the gypsum people said, well, wait a minute, we have a 2-hour, 3-hour wall here that we can use. So why not let us use that for type 3 construction? And most jurisdictions, but not all, have allowed that. So New Jersey does not allow that, for example. And then the next tranche down is all wood construction. These are all sprinklered. And then you go down in lower and lower tranches. And there are costs, each of these tranches. The level of protection, the fire protection that the building is given changes as you move up. There's a sprinkler system where you are required to sprinkler everything, including interstitial spaces and closets, versus a sprinkler system that you only have to do the major rooms. And the theory between the two systems is one allows you to get everybody out of the building, but the building will be damaged beyond repair once the catastrophic event happens. But theoretically, everyone is safe. The other one tries to salvage the building. Theoretically, will stop it so you can repair the building and keep the building. So those are tranches in the building codes that aren't quite understood, that are outlined in the types that I put through into the book. And then once you get down to the meager end of the building code, there's actually another code that it takes over called the residential code. And the IRC, International Residential Code, allows for single-family homes and duplexes and townhouses to get built. And there used to be a little gray area between the residential code and the building code where you could start doing duplexes vertically or trying to combine them and do duplexes side by side, but they've added language to tighten that up. And anything that is more than 2 units or not a townhouse row ends up going into the building code these days. And then there are market types that happen that are in the book just because there are different ways of thinking about what the code allows, and developers have done interesting things over time.
We're having these arguments about housing, especially here in San Francisco. And I found that specific part of the book super interesting, and thinking about all the different building types and the financing too. I mean, thinking about how you finance different types of buildings was really fascinating. I'm wondering if you could illuminate that a little bit as well.
Sure. So there's different kinds of challenges from the supply end. I think in a city like San Francisco or Philadelphia, one of the big questions you have is the city so market tight that it's harder to build in the city than it would be to have a factory build it in the suburbs or in a rural section and truck it into the city and build it there. So in places like San Francisco, you're actually seeing a lot of modular housing getting built because it's cheaper to have portions of the buildings or great portions of the buildings being built in Nevada and driven into San Francisco. That's one supply side aspect. On the financing side, it really depends on the scale of the product. For single family homes and additive ADU, accessory dwelling units, they all still depend on the loan that a homeowner can get based on income. Well, a lot of jurisdictions are now allowing the addition of accessory dwelling units to meet the demand of those who are not looking for a single family home. There's not a lot of great finance systems out there for that. And typically it's based on the income of the person who owns a large house who's then building a unit in their backyard, either a granny flat or another kind of unit. There are some In the stacked housing worlds, where you're building one unit over another or two units over another, up to 4 units, there are some FHA loans that are out there. There's a whole group called the Incremental Development Alliance you may be familiar with, and they're promoting those finance systems for smaller developers so they can go out and work through those mechanisms. Once you're beyond those scales, it's really institutional development where one needs to find both equity and debt financing through local banks in Wall Street or investors' banks in Wall Street to put together a project.
Yeah, here in San Francisco, I know that there was a recent newspaper article about, I think it was a pension fund that was saying that they were going to step up and fund a bunch of affordable housing because of the shortage of potential funders out there. So that financing piece is really interesting to see where it comes from and who is actually backing it. And affordable housing, we think, oh, well, it's nice. We can build 100% affordable housing and we'll just do it. And then you need to find the financing. You need to figure out all the details about what tax cuts and tax breaks you can get and all that stuff. So it's really complicated.
What I just spoke about before was purely market rate housing.
Right,
The affordable
exactly.
housing world is very different. And I'm not the expert in my office, but there are others who are. There's a tax credit system. The state endorses certain projects every year. And to get that endorsement, you often have to put forth a project that's fairly well developed, saying you're going to do certain things for the state to put up their money that allows you to then use their 4% or 9.5% tax credits. And it's a very challenging system with lots of sources that those developers who specialize in that world are very sophisticated in putting together. And because it's so specialized, there's a high threshold to get into that work because you really need to know to get a project to be successful how the tax credit system works and how you bring the other sources together to make a successful project. And there aren't that many developers who are good at that and succeed in that realm.
You also mention in the book that you break down buildings into types. They're much more easily measured by big data, et cetera. And in fact, you actually measured some fiscal benefits to town centers as opposed to drivable suburban retail, et cetera. Is there a dark side to that type of market math where we can calculate everything about a building and, its type, and then it's almost like that derivative thing that happened during the last market crash?
Well,
I guess my question is there a dark side to doing all the math?
so let's just say, is there a dark side to big data in the real estate industry? And there absolutely is. You can see it in Houston today, where there are developers who realized that there was a delta between what the mortgage was for single family homes in certain neighborhoods and what the rental income could be in those neighborhoods. And they've gone out and bought whole neighborhoods. I mean, wholesale neighborhoods are owned by 3 or 4 developers now, single family neighborhoods. Is that a good or bad thing? I do think that our country had, for years, we were all about home ownership and about the stability and the strength that gave citizens by investing in the communities they're in. And I think over the last 10 years, there's been, I'll say, a political lack of focus on that interest. I mean, particularly since 2007, some in the finance industry pushed back and said, there are many people here who shouldn't be homeowners. And the 2008, 2009 recession is caused by that. And I'm not so sure that's the case. I think that we just set up a system where folks who wanted to be homeowners and wanted to be invested in their community were not empowered to do so. And I think those same people in the 50s and 60s were being empowered to be homeowners. And I think that's a flaw. So that's one of the challenges in the big data. I think there are folks taking advantage of that. And there are more people being forced into rental regimes that are not helping them build wealth and equity in their world. So that's a negative. On the positive, I think there are ways that we're seeing communities realize the value of amenities that otherwise weren't valued previously. So the city of Boston did a study where they went out and I believe with a group called, I think it's Supernormal, they're a planning group out of Somerville. And they tried to figure out what helps bring up values in neighborhoods. And they figured out, wow, if you add a coffee shop, that really brings up the values. If you have a grocery store, that really brings up the values. And so through that understanding of the big data numbers, like here's a coffee shop, these townhouses, and this community has the same economic buying power as this community over here, but this one has a coffee shop, this one doesn't. Their values are depressed this much more. So if we figure a way to get a coffee shop over here, we'll have a stronger neighborhood, and they're proving that in what they're doing. So they're starting to add those or help subsidize those amenities to their community through their work. They're also doing that kind of analysis in Pittsburgh, in the different neighborhoods there, seeing how certain neighborhoods are starting to accelerate in their growth and how other neighborhoods could accelerate in their growth. We're doing work in ways of trying to find how we can, and it's a process that we call edification in our firm, where when a neighborhood is becoming exciting again to folks who want to come back, how we can add all these new people and not displace the folks who have been there before, and how the new housing still allows for those who were there before to remain in the neighborhood that they loved. And even though the neighborhood will change, it changes, but it changes in an inclusive way. We've seen that in our work in Southwest DC, an area called Arthur Capper. There used to be 3, maybe 4 solely affordable housing projects on the south side of 395 here in DC. That's now where the ballpark district is. There's now more affordable housing in the ballpark district than there ever was when it was just affordable housing projects. And so you've got a great neighborhood with lots of amenities that are thriving for the new people who come in. And there's now more affordable housing than there was before, when it was an entirely affordable public housing area, which was reinforcing negative worldviews of that community, both from within and without, that are now gone. The stigma is gone, and that housing is there, but now within much greater community is greater as a whole.
That's interesting. We recently had on Andre Perry of Brookings to talk about his book that he wrote about devaluing Black lives and Black property. And it was interesting to hear him talk about his home in Pittsburgh, where his neighborhood that he grew up in was right next to a growing neighborhood, East Liberty, the one where Google has moved in. Basically, that neighborhood has grown up and done really well and has gotten a lot of investment. But the neighborhood that he grew up in, just a couple of BRT stops down, hasn't necessarily seen that investment. And then they've calculated how much Black property has been, devalued. And they have the same bones, they have the same building stock, they have the same street network, all the things that you would think that make up good urban neighborhoods, but the value is lower. And so I'm also curious, like, how this big data can actually help in the ways that you were talking about, bring these neighborhoods to be at the same level as neighborhoods that are exactly the same.
Well, on top of all the layers you just mentioned, and particularly in Pittsburgh, there's now this new layer of the opportunity zone matrix that, there are certain cities in this country where the money is particularly flowing to in the system that the federal government set up with Senator Tim Scott and put through the federal government. And Pittsburgh is one of those cities where there's a few neighborhoods really close to downtown and close to the areas on both rivers that we're expecting a lot of redevelopment and development to happen. Atlanta's seeing a lot. We're working on a couple projects there in opportunity zones. We're working in Baltimore in opportunity zone areas. And again, whether it's fulfilling the ultimate mission of the Opportunity Zone program, there's no doubt that it is allowing capital from the highest reaches of our financial system to flow into areas that were neglected and hadn't received capital before. It will remain to be seen where that will be done successfully and where it won't be done well at all. And I think when it's all over, I'm sure there'll be lots of academic papers and reports on where the Opportunity Zones did great work and where they didn't. And then the ones that we're working on, we're trying to create neighborhoods that pull from the neighborhoods that are there already. They're not like spaceships landing from outer space. They reflect and embrace the character and the culture that are there. And again, allowing that to grow, but not allowing that to be deflected or defeated. It's a very strong aspect of what we do because frankly, few people move to completely new places. There's always something of interest or there's always some charm in neighborhoods, even neighborhoods that are super tough. Bed-Stuy's got some great character, right? And for years was ignored. People don't know this, but in the 70s, Chelsea was on the edge of being extremely rough. And there were some very innovative programs that came through, particularly the J51 program, that created an environment that developers could get financing to bring in and revitalize all those buildings and transform it into an exclusive and very expensive neighborhood that we know today. But that wasn't always the case. And those programs, that fostering of the neighborhood, of helping those neighborhoods come along, those methodologies are still out there for jurisdictions today. Both, not just the Opportunity Zone at the federal level, but state and local level can come up with these. J51 was a city program, I believe. At the end of the horrible challenges that New York City had with the Bronx's burning in 1977, they turned that into a very exclusive Manhattan today, where even 125th Street has transformed. But there are still aspects of the culture still there, although Lenox Lounge is gone, and that's those are losses that happen when you change. And I would rather see a 125th Street that still had Lenox Lounge. But,
Yeah. change, is hard. And I think that we're seeing sometimes in some cities like Manhattan where it might be even going too far just from a displacement perspective. So many people with so much money and it's so expensive to live there. But that's a whole other conversation, I think. Something else that you mentioned that's really interesting, you talk about Euclidean zoning and how that's easy just to plug and play in a lot of places. And so it's really hard to kind of reverse that. It's been in place for so long that we're trying to think of ways to fix it, but it's really hard.
So I've always been a fan of typological zoning, and that's part of what this book is meant to feed into. And there's been a big fight within the New Urbans community about, whether the smart code was not, whether we should be doing more form-based codes or whether you need the smart code as a way of fixing existing codes. And I tend to lean towards we really need to wholesale throw out a lot of the Euclidean zones, particularly in walkable communities. And weirdly enough, Texas is a place where this is happening. There's a master plan for Bryan, Texas, that if you don't know about, you should probably get a hold of the guy who did it. Bryan, Texas is a college town where there was a lot of surreptitious undermining of the single family zoning, and people would rent out units, but quietly put a kitchen in the back. And so they redid the zoning to allow for new buildings to get built that would meet this need. But what they did is they created a typological zone where you don't even need a building permit anymore. The buildings are pre-approved. And so it accelerates the ability to build these units, that there are 4 base types that maybe are 16 overall building types in the end that are plug and play. The city owns the drawings. So if you're a landowner in one of these zones and you want to put these up, you literally, all you got to do is go in and a week later you have your permit, you can start building.
Wow.
And that's very powerful.
Yeah.
That's the power of typological zoning. If you can finally have these types that the whole community agrees, that this is okay in our community, and someone can just come in and build it. That I see as the future of where we're going to be going with the zoning and development, at least at the smaller scale.
Yeah, we're having a big fight here about byright development, and people are up in arms about the inability to block things.
Right.
I think I read a piece in the Mercury News yesterday about how there's a person who is building a single family home and they paid $2.5 million for the land, and they want to build a home like down the street from these other $3.5 million places. And the city or the town or the whatever it's called just said, no, you can't build that, even though they were in the zoning envelope. They did everything to code. But we have a law, the Accountability Act basically says, like, if they follow all the rules, you should be able to build. And so there's an organization that's been suing these cities. So that would be great if you could just walk into a planning office and get a type and then just be out the door the next day. That would be amazing and change everything, it feels like, especially in some of these neighborhoods. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and so I used to drive through Bryan on the way to school sometimes, or was there for races or things like that. But yeah, Texas is an interesting spot, just from the differences that they have in allowance of building versus other places around the country. It's frustrating because I know that here in California, we're basically just pushing people away, and actually not even just pushing people away from California, but pushing people away from cities. When people move out to the wildland interface, then you have these fires and then they burn down, neighborhoods and houses and people's lives. And some of these folks, they want to live out there, and I understand that. But also, there's a lot of people that would rather live in the city and they just can't. So they move to these places and then their lives get ruined by something else. So we have a big reckoning, I think, coming in that realm.
It's very strange times for I think there's a lot of change that needs to happen in this world. We're certainly thinking about how we can make better communities. I mean, living in Kentlands, we have so many more amenities here because we're all in big houses, but they're big houses that have ADUs, that have granny flats, that have English basements, that they're 16-foot townhouses and 24-foot townhouses. And because they're all together, we're able to support the restaurants and the movie theater and all that. And I hope other towns start to see that as they grow.
What's your favorite section of the book?
Oof, it's such a compilation. So I learned a lot about putting together the stacked housing products, the missing middle types. A lot of those types really run the edges of the building code to try to find the way they can function in the world today. Some are just challenged in terms of travel distance down. And so those things I learned on certain types. What I liked was finding new types that I didn't know exist. I mean, there are a couple types I discovered after we were too late to press that I'd love to get in if we ever get a second edition, that are out there that are really neat that I just don't have in there. But my favorite part of making the book was learning and finding and discovering things that I hadn't known about.
Yeah, and then that was my next question was there anything that surprised you when you were going through and looking for these types? And I know that you've been working on this for so many years, but as you know, there's always something that comes up and surprises us.
We I forgot about a type that was in our own portfolio that I realized, oh wow, this has got to get in here. And then and it took forever to find the images and get the graphics for them. There were projects I knew about and I was always impressed with, but I was excited to learn more in depth about. There's a couple more polyzoides projects out in Pasadena, the Del Mar project. You can tell it's a typologically mixed project. You can tell it's trying to segue from the transit station to the neighborhood nearby in how it's masked, but then calling to get the imagery, and once receiving that imagery, understanding what's in there and how it looks and how it works and the particular types they mix together. That was really wonderful. I actually learned a lot just by looking at that particular firm, Polyzoides. They do some very sophisticated, cost-effective solutions that are not easy to draw. I mean, they're not afraid of drawing very difficult architectural work. They're making more work for themselves to get their clients, as we do to some degree, to get a great project that you're working to make it better, make it more cost effective, but make a better neighborhood out of that. And so there's a couple projects in the book that I learned more about, a couple that I didn't lead at my firm that I learned about doing the research into them as well.
I always enjoyed that Del Mar station just for the plain fact that they ran a train through it.
And that caused some issues for them.
Right.
And you can see, there's
Gates and all that stuff too.
Yeah, the gates they had to add in the end, and that's a disappointment, but needed for how the place works. But there are a lot of projects, there's a couple of projects that didn't make it in the book that I learned about. And I'm on a Facebook group and we were talking about how did they do this? Like, this doesn't meet code, doesn't meet code, doesn't meet code. And it was a puzzle to try to figure out what their code justification was for doing what they did. And in the end, we were like, yeah, that works, but it's crazy how they did it. And a lot of it has to do with travel distance to the most remote place of the furthest unit away from the door, particularly when you're doing stacked and missing middle housing. And so a lot of times you look at a project that looks big and you're like, well, how did they make that one work? And there's a couple I actually admire and was not able to include in the book because I didn't think they met code. And so again, just the book is meant to be a resource for those who are trying to find a product that might work, either in a specific condition or if you're a developer and you've got a master plan to fill out, to allow for more creativity and more to appeal to more people, to allow more lifestyles to come into a project. Part of what it shows, and it's not clear in the way it's presented, is there are a lot of different types appealing to different people and different personalities, all within the same price point. It's not hard to build them. And so I think that's the biggest lesson learned from that. And the other big lesson learned from the book was about how much of a burden the privatized mobility is. It costs about $5,000 or $7,000 to build a bathroom and $10,000 to build a kitchen. But in a lot of jurisdictions, they're requiring 2 parking spaces that cost $25,000 each to build. If it's underground, $50,000 each. So the most expensive part of the housing has nothing to do with the housing. It has entirely everything to do with the fact that you've got to add these parking spaces to it, that you're privatizing the mobility. And if you took that out, if you had transit, your housing costs would go way down. In some places, the parking is the same price as the actual unit, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's really nuts. I'm glad to see that a lot of places are just getting rid of parking requirements altogether, but it's kind of a slow process all over the country. Coronavirus has also kind of upended, a lot of our thinking about home workplaces.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there's anything in the book that you would change now. I imagine you put most of this together before, but is there anything that would change based on our lessons from the pandemic?
No, most of what's in there is sort of resilient and timeless. The adjustments we're seeing have to do with subtleties. So in a multifamily building, we're seeing in the unit mixes these days, there being a desire for more 1+ dens versus 1-bedroom units. What I'm about to mention, I think was a trend already, but it's now augmented by what's happened with the coronavirus, which is we're seeing a lot more big balconies on units. So if you go to Brisbane or the Gold Coast in Queensland, almost all the multifamily there, you have a residential unit and they're the same size as inside as what we have here. But every one of those units has a 10 by 12 balcony. It's a big room outside that has a large dining table and even an area to sit. Occasionally they'll have barbecues on them. And that is just part of the culture there. A multifamily unit there has that. And that's starting to happen here too. We're seeing the desire for that. I was working on a project in the Metroplex, Dallas Metroplex, where it had a natural feature that was unusual for the area, a big creek running through it. And so we required that all the buildings that had frontages on that creek to have deep balconies. And that was part of the planning exercise, the regiment that we came up with for that project. There's other overlays too. There was style and incremental overlays for that project. But having, this one frontage where both sides of the creek had these deeper balconies was what we felt was important. And part of when you set up these standards, you're setting it up, particularly if there are going to be multiple developers brought in over time, you're setting it up so each developer has the confidence that other developers are going to deliver to the high level that you're expecting them to deliver at. And if you set up the rules, they'll all buy into that process and deliver great results.
Who do you hope picks up the book?
Yeah, who's the audience? So there's multiple audiences. There's a student audience. It's a resource on what's getting built today in walkable places. There's an audience of the development community, particularly those who are doing infill. It got the spectrum of housing that's being built in zero lot line environments. If you're working in a zero lot line environment, a city or a suburban walkable district, the types of products that are getting built in all the master plans out there and in cities are in that book. And then architects. The architectural community is very fragmented. There aren't a lot of broad architects. The Tortigal is a very unusual firm because of the breadth that we do. There are architects that just work on hospitals and prisons, and there are architects that just work on retail, and there are architects that just work on single-family homes or luxury homes. And this book allows an architect to grow their breadth, to get a little broader, to see beyond their particular market segment, because there aren't that many firms that have the breadth that my particular firm we're accustomed to in what we do.
I appreciate that. There's a lot in here, I must say. Well, the book is Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities. Brian, where can folks find it?
You can find it on the Oro website. You can also find it on Amazon. And bookstores were coming back. We'll see if they're still open in a couple months, but a bookstore near you.
Yeah, we tell folks to go to bookshop.org, and you can actually find your local bookshop. And if you order it through them, they'll give them a part of the proceeds. So that's a good way to go. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.